Okay, ladies and gentlemen, so today what we're going to do is we're going to focus on time period number 5. And really in this first part, we're going to take a look at the development of sectionalism, the increased sectionalism between the North and the South, and then also the Civil War and some of the changes that are brought about due to the Civil War. So the beginning of the screencast, we're really going to focus on the political causes of the Civil War. So if you take a look at this, first you have to understand that the causes of the Civil War really trace way back before the beginning of this time period. So this time period starts in 1848. This is by no means the beginning of sectionalism in America. You can trace sectionalism back really to the American Revolution or prior even to colonial America and things that are dividing up the North and the South. And so that's the first thing to kind of understand. This has been going on. The things that we talked about in the antebellum time period that are dividing up the North and South politically. Think about the economic differences between the North and the South, the market revolution, which is transforming the North in the time period, and the South's dependence on cotton, those economic factors, also the social factors of immigration, all different things that are kind of playing into the differences between the North and the South. So it's not just political, and it's not just during this time period, but we're just going to focus on some of the major political events that kind of lead America down the road towards this Civil War. Now, the first big thing that you want to focus on in this time period is a huge piece of land that America gains called the Mexican Cession. So we fought the Mexican-American War from 1845 to 1848. And after the victory in the Mexican-American War, we gained a huge piece of territory called the Mexican Cession. Now, remember, every time we gain a piece of territory in the United States, the important thing to understand here is, yes, we are doubling and, expanding the size of our nation every time we do this. What we're also doing is reopening the question of slavery. Every piece of territory here that we gain, the question of slavery has to be addressed. So in this first piece of territory, they came up with the Northwest and the Southwest ordinances. The Northwest ordinance banned slavery, the Southwest ordinance permitted it. And so it kind of extended sectionalism. With the Louisiana Purchase, we talked about the Missouri Compromise that they came up with, where they drew that 36° 30 north latitude line that banned slavery above the line but permitted slavery below it. So every piece of territory, they have to come up with a rule or a system for how to determine whether a territory can be a slave state or a free state. Now, as time goes on into the 1800s, increasingly Northerners want to try and keep slavery out of these new territories. And a lot of them, it's not because of their moral outrage due to slavery. A lot of it has to do with political power. And so you have this free soil movement that's growing, and you see that reflected in proposals that are made when states want to come into the Union. So you saw that in the Louisiana Purchase with the Talmadge Amendment trying to ban slavery completely in this new territory. You're going to see it again in the Mexican Cession with a proposal called the Wilmot Proviso, where David Wilmot tries to convince other senators to ban, slavery completely in the Mexican Cession. Neither times has it passed, but it shows you that Northerners are kind of seeing this as a political issue of power in the government. Now, in the Mexican Cession, California applies to be a state very quickly due to the California gold rush and people wanting to go out there for fertile soil in California to grow different crops. And so they apply to be a state, and they want to be a free state. So when Congress makes this decision with the Compromise of 1850, they try to appease the North and the South. What really ends up happening is they end up appeasing nobody. Everybody kind of walks away from the Compromise of 1850 pretty angry and frustrated about the situation, and it increases the tension in the country. So they permit California to come into the nation as a free state, and then with the rest of the Mexican Cession, they're going to allow the concept of popular sovereignty to govern whether they come in as free or slave states. And so popular sovereignty is this idea of allowing the people to decide the issue. So it could be for slavery, it could be for temperance, whatever the issue might be, but it's to go directly to the people and let them vote on the issue. The last component of the Mexican Cession is that they're also going to include a fugitive slave law in the Compromise of 1850. And this fugitive slave law, what it did was it kind of forced Northerners to be complicit in helping Southerners to return runaway slaves back to the South. Now this had been on the books for a while, but was never really widely enforced. And so Northerners are kind of pretty outraged about this fugitive slave law. because increasingly the North is becoming more and more anti-slavery, if not abolitionist. More people are kind of turning towards the anti-slavery viewpoint. And so what it leads to is a very famous book written by an author named Harriet Beecher Stowe, who is the daughter of famous Second Great Awakening preacher Lyman Beecher, and she writes this book called Uncle Tom's Cabin. So Uncle Tom's Cabin kind of has a profound effect on the northern viewpoint of slavery, because what it does is it kind of humanizes slavery for a lot of northerners and shows them like the horrible experience that slaves are kind of going through this story. So she writes this novel, and it's similar in certain ways as far as its impact is concerned. You can kind of draw the comparison between Uncle Tom's Cabin and Common Sense before the American Revolution. Although Common Sense is a political pamphlet and this is a novel, they both have big influences on people's viewpoints about issues before major American wars. Now, as the time goes on in the time period, things and tension and sectionalism increases further. Okay, so the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 is kind of the brainchild of famous Senator Stephen Douglas from Illinois. Now, if you look at the territories that are in question here, the Kansas and Nebraska territory, they are a part of the Louisiana territory. So this should be governed by the Missouri Compromise and the 36 degree 30 north latitude line. Now, Stephen Douglas, his major aim here is he wants to actually build a transcontinental railroad connecting his home state of Illinois out to California and the developing west of the United States. Now, he's running into a lot of problems with Southern senators, and so what Stephen Douglas proposes is to kind of reopen this territory of Kansas. Instead of making it strictly a free territory, he wants to reopen it to the idea of popular sovereignty. And he hopes that's going to appease Southerners to get them to vote for his Transcontinental Railroad and to vote for the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And it works. So he's able to get Southern support. Now, essentially what it does, though, is it causes a ton of increased sectionalism in the country, because Kansas virtually has no settlers living there. And so you have people who come from the border over from Missouri who rush to the state. You have abolitionist, extremists kind of rush to the state. They're both trying to sway each side. And what it leads to is an event in American history known as Bleeding Kansas. And it's kind of like a mini civil war that breaks out in Kansas between the abolitionists and the pro-slavery advocates. And famously, this is where John Brown makes his first foray onto the national scene. And essentially, it highlights really the sectional division within the country. And real violence is breaking out at this point. And it's kind of filters over into Congress as well. If you remember the event called the Crime Against Kansas, where you have congressmen actually, fighting on the Senate floor. And so this kind of violence is kind of permeating in the society around this sectional division, around this issue of slavery and whether it should be allowed or not allowed. Now, both on the Supreme Court side and kind of the debate side, or the intellectual kind of debate about this idea of popular sovereignty, you're going to see huge events that again are going to further divide Northerners and Southerners. So a famous case in the time period is called the Dred Scott case. And in this Supreme Court case, the full Supreme Court case is Dred Scott v. Sanford. In this case, famously, you have a slave who wants to sue for his freedom. And his logic is that he was taken from a slave state into a free territory. And because of that, because he's residing in a free territory for an extensive period of time, he believes that the laws that make him a slave no longer apply. So he sues in the Supreme Court. Now, the Chief Justice at the time, Roger Taney, famously says that no, not only can he not sue, he kind of like throws the case out and says he cannot sue. He also kind of goes two steps further, and he says that because Dred Scott is a slave and African American, he can never be a citizen within the United States. So that kind of like tied race to citizenship within the country in this pre-Civil War era. And then what it also did was it kind of null and voided the Missouri Compromise, because what Roger Taney's decision really said was that prohibiting slavery above a certain point, above the 36° 30 north latitude line, was really unconstitutional. And you couldn't do something like that. And it's a violation of people's rights. So that's kind of interesting. That's a real Southern kind of viewpoint of it from the time period, that slavery was a right, and, you know, prohibiting slavery was banning or prohibiting somebody's rights. Now, on the intellectual debate side of this, you have, famously, we'll see Abraham Lincoln kind of make his first big appearance onto the national scene. He had been a congressman before this, a Whig party congressman, but now he's going to really kind of start to make a name for himself through some of these famous debates with Stephen Douglas. So they're both from Illinois, and they're debating not, you know, for the presidency. What they're doing is they're debating for the Senate seat from Illinois. And they kind of go around the state, you know, having these different debates. And Stephen Douglas is trying to make the argument for popular sovereignty in regards to the slavery issue. And Abraham Lincoln is really trying to make the argument that really slavery extended to the territories in any capacity is immoral and should not be allowed. And his big argument, this is where he makes his famous House Divided speech, where, you know, a house divided against itself cannot stand, that America cannot continue half free and half slave, and this is going to be the end of us. So we have to make a decision whether we're going to be totally free or totally slave states. And so, like, Lincoln is really kind of making this strong advocacy for free soil in these new territories. Now, when a lot of Southerners hear what Lincoln is saying, what they hear is that, you know, Lincoln wants to abolish slavery everywhere in America. Now, again, these are Senate debates. These are not presidential debates. But then when Lincoln goes on the ticket for the presidency, these comments and these ideas are remembered. And, you know, he's aboard in the South for his stances on slavery, because they're afraid that it's going to lead to the abolishment of slavery within the country. Now, things again become even more violent within the country. So John Brown, who kind of made his first appearance on the national scene in Kansas, in Bleeding, Kansas, and committed some atrocities there, he also is going to try and start a slave revolt throughout the South. And so this is known as John Brown's Raid on Harper's Ferry, where he tries to storm the arsenal where they hold a lot of weapons in Harper's Ferry, Virginia, and start a popular slave uprising. Now, it really doesn't go anywhere as far as being a successful slave uprising. John Brown is captured pretty quickly, and eventually he's hanged for treason. And so what's, I think, important about John Brown is the legacy. As time goes on for the abolitionist cause, he kind of becomes like a martyr to the abolitionist cause. And you see that kind of like in this painting, which is not, you know, a true depiction of what happened to John Brown as he was going to the gallows, but it kind of shows like the abolitionist viewpoint of John Brown. Now, it also puts a lot of fear into Southerners, because this is Southerners' worst nightmare, that slaves will have a popular uprising against Southern society. And so they kind of see now Northerners agitating this idea and increasing this sectionalism within the nation. Okay, the last thing we're just going to kind of touch on is the election of 1860, which eventually leads to the Southern Secession. So in this election, Lincoln is going to win the election, but if you look at the election here, there's 4 candidates that run. And so the South is pretty divided amongst the Upper South and the Lower South between Breckinridge and Bell. The North is really a contest between Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas. And although Douglas doesn't really win a lot of states, he wins a lot of popular vote. Lincoln wins all of your northern states, and that's how he's able to carry the presidency. But if you look at this, it's a very sectionally divided election. And what's going to happen in the wake of the election is that the Lower South is going to secede starting in December and January of 1860 in response to Lincoln becoming the president, because they believe Lincoln is going to try to abolish slavery within the nation. Later on, in 1861, the Upper South is going to follow. And so this is going to be our prelude in the beginning to our Civil War that breaks out in 1861. Okay, we're going to continue in part 2 of the screencast with the Civil War itself and what happens during the Civil War.